Good afternoon, everybody. And again, welcome back to the United Regional Chambers weekly update. We try to bring you on some interesting subjects, some interesting guests to keep you informed. With all the crazy weather that we've had over the past month and a half and all the heavy rains, we've fielded a couple of questions here at the Chamber about flood and flood insurance. And so I reached out to one of our members, and I'd like to introduce Greg Safford. Greg is the president of Safford Insurance, and he's more versed in this flood insurance stuff than I certainly am. So I thought I'd bring on one of my local experts. Greg, welcome.
Thanks, Jack. Glad to be here.
First off, tell us a little about Greg.
I'm the president of Safford Axia Insurance, or Safford Insurance and Axia Company, here in Franklin, Massachusetts. I've been here for a long time, but I've been in the industry for 20 years and have done insurance from coast to coast, including flood, which I think is what we're here to talk about. I don't know what else you want to know. A couple of kids, a couple of dogs. So if you hear any barking in the background, I'm going to apologize. That's why I've sequestered myself.
Well, you sequestered yourself as much as you can, but with a full house, sometimes that's tough.
Right, and the kids are home from school too. So yes. But my office is more noisy. It's on a busy street, so I figured this
Let's just jump in then. So what is a flood zone and why does it matter?
All right, so a flood zone is FEMA's estimation of how likely a particular location is to receive inundation, to be flooded. And they have a number of different zones. They start out with, super, super high risk zones. Think like right on the coast where it's subject to both wave action and, high tide, storm surge, that kind of thing. Anything that's right next to a lake is going to be a high risk flood zone. And it keeps working its way down. I won't get into the super details anymore, unless you want to get into the nitty gritty. But most people are in a low risk flood zone, which is referred to as a flood zone X. It doesn't mean no risk. It just means low risk.
Okay, and who determines and governs the flood zones?
Right, that's going to be FEMA. So FEMA uses the mapping to determine just where and how that flooding looks. And if we want to bring up the map, actually, I can show it, and it'll make a little more sense of what's going on here. So this is in the Franklin area. And you can see this orange section over here is going to be a flood zone AE, which means it's at reasonably high risk of flooding at least once every 100 years is sort of the rule of thumb on it. When you see the flood zone A here, this is extremely high risk. In fact, if we come over here, you can see that lakes themselves get considered a flood zone A, super high risk. All this that doesn't look like it's in a flood zone, this is when people say, I'm not in a flood zone, this is what they're talking about. It just means that their mortgage company is not requiring flood. They are in a flood zone. It's a flood zone X, meaning relatively low risk. But flood zone X, this low risk flood zone, does account for about 30% of federal disaster aid for flooding and about 20% of the national flood insurance flood claims. So just because you're in low risk doesn't mean you can't be inundated.
Well, I know 100 years ago when I was in the mortgage business, that was always a big bone of contention with the banks. And flood insurance, as we'll talk about in a minute, can be very expensive depending on where you're at. But let's get back to this for a second. How can I find out if I'm in a flood zone?
So you can go to FEMA's website, and there's a link. I think we can pop that on the screen here. There it is right there. So you can go to this FEMA.gov website, and it'll bring up exactly what I was just showing you on the screen there. And you can enter your address, you can pop it in there, and it'll show you where you lie in the flood zone mapping. So that's sort of the quick and dirty way to do it. It tends to be pretty accurate in my experience, as long as your particular area is mapped by FEMA, which almost everything, in our neck of the woods is. If you really need to be very specific, maybe you have a property that you're just not quite sure if the building itself is really in that flood zone and the map you can't zoom in enough to tell. In those cases, you're going to want a flood elevation certificate or a flood certificate, something to designate very specifically, potentially even using a surveyor. But that's rare at this point in time.
And would you need to use a surveyor to get that certificate?
Not necessarily. Most of the time, we can just put the address in, and it's going to verify and validate which flood zone that they're in. It's, like I said, it's pretty rare to actually need a surveyor to come out and look at it.
Well, I know flood insurance, there's many different versions and it's very complicated. Tell us about flood insurance and what's different from flood insurance than the regular homeowners insurance that you have.
Right. So your insurance for your home or your business excludes flood. It's really that simple. I shouldn't say that quite as a blanket, but very, very, very rare exceptions to that. So just assume that your business building coverage or your homeowners does not include flood. And by flood, I mean rising groundwater, right? So that's what it is. It's rising groundwater. That's a flood. And flood insurance protects you from that particular risk. Flood insurance is not going to help you in a fire. It's not going to help you in anything else. It's just going to protect you from flood. Now, here's the thing about flood insurance. There are a couple of things to keep in mind. Number one, it's not as generous as your regular, say, homeowners insurance is going to be, or your regular business insurance is going to be. It's going to have a lot of stipulations about specifically what it's going to cover and where it's going to cover it, especially in a basement. So when you're talking about homeowners, for example, your basement's going to be limited to the tear out, the dry out, the framing. They'll put the drywall back up if it was finished, but they're not going to mud and tape it. They're not going to paint it. They're not going to pay for the trim work. Those sorts of things are sort of excluded. Your personal property in the basement is usually excluded, with the exception of things that are like home systems. So most of your water heaters, your oil tanks, like things like that are going to typically be covered. So that's the first one, is just be aware of what it actually covers. The second is what constitutes a flood, right? What triggers the coverage? Typically, that's going to be either an inundation of over 2 acres, could be 1 acre depending on the policy, and or 2 properties. And that's usually where we see in our more urban areas and suburban areas. It's the 2 properties that usually triggers it, because a lot of times we can consider the street a property. So if the street is affected and you're affected, a lot of times we can get it taken care of.
So you don't mean that you need to insure both properties on the same street. It's if 2, 3 properties on the same street got hit with water, your insurance companies would work together.
No, great question. Great question. So if you had, say, 3 properties, your neighbors on either side of you and yourself, and all 3 of you got flooded, each of you would need to have individual flood insurance policies, one for each property. So if your neighbors didn't carry the flood insurance and you did, you would potentially likely have coverage, and they, of course, because they don't have policies, wouldn't.
Okay. Well, Greg, tell us a little bit more about you and your business. You've helped us with the flood insurance. People can go to that site and check out, because I see we got some more heavy rains coming on Friday. But tell us a little bit more about your business.
Yeah, so I moved here from Memphis, Tennessee. I grew up on the West Coast, but I moved here from Memphis, Tennessee. Started a scratch agency, meaning right from the ground up, in 2017. Grew it to the point where I needed to add staff, and instead of doing that, I merged with another agency that I knew well, to provide that staffing, allow me to continue to grow, focusing on the coverage aspect that my clients need, and a little bit less on the regular day-to-day billing type of things. And we can help with anything involving your personal insurance, of course, or business insurance. Pretty much if it has the word insurance in it, I can help with it. I can answer the questions about it, or at the very least, I can point you in the right direction. Somebody in our office will handle it and do it excellently.
All right. So if somebody has a question about flood insurance, can they give you a call, or should they call their agent, or what should they do?
No, I'd be happy to take the call. I'm going to pop this
Yeah, I should
in
have asked you
the
this
little
earlier.
chat there. Yeah, no, I think we might have it. So I'm going to put the contact number in there. It's 774-847-1106. That's my line. And I'll also put my email address in here. And since this is a little surprise, it might take a second to get it up on the screen there, but there
Yep.
we go. All right. I'd be happy to take the call. Your agent should be able to answer your questions about it, but my experience is a lot of agents really aren't that versed in flood. It can get really, really detailed. Most of the time, not a big deal. Real quick phone call, we can get it taken care of, and get you a quote. 2 other things to keep in mind with flood. The National Flood Insurance Program is what most people are familiar with. That's the federal flood insurance. But we now have private flood insurance options that are accepted by mortgage lenders, and they tend to be a lot less expensive. So, Jack, you were saying it was really expensive sometimes.
Yeah.
What happens is FEMA uses these big, huge, and they've gotten better about it, but they're still pretty big blocks and tracts of land. So they didn't, up until very recently, they didn't even care if you're at the bottom of that or the top of it. You could be on the top of a cliff, but still in the same block, and they'd still consider you high risk. The private flood insurance companies use a lot of elevation and relief mapping to determine where you're at and really try to rate the individual property accurately. And as a result, a lot of times you can get into some sort of flood coverage for $300 to $500 a year.
Wow, that's a great tip, because I when I was in the mortgage business, that was a big bone of contention, because I did a lot of on the coast, and they were up on a cliffside, but they still were required. Well,
Yep.
again, Greg Safford, thanks for taking the time and sharing your knowledge with us. Any final thoughts?
No, just ask the questions. Ask the questions. That's all you can do. And if you're not satisfied with the answer, if it's not clear, go find another source for it. I'm always here to help as well, of course.
Great. Well, Greg, thank you very much. We'll see you at one of our networking events, because he's a big proponent of that for us. Now, another shout out to James Friedman and his team over there at AACS for putting up with me every week. We truly appreciate all the stuff that you do for us. Folks, hope to see you next week. Stay safe.
Take care.